This is our latest of many webinars, and our topic today is the conflict over Ukraine. Where should the left stand? Obviously, this topic has exercised many of us, and this seminar has attracted a great deal of interest precisely from people who have been racking their heads over what is the correct stance to take. Over the past 6 months and more, as Russia started its military operations in Ukraine, as the West armed Ukraine, combining uncompromising rhetoric with deeply compromised and convenient sanctions against Russia, and equally compromised and convenient arms deliveries to Ukraine, urging it, in the words of realist international relations scholar John Mearsheimer, to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. As all these things have happened, the left has splintered into a range of positions, from opposition to the West to opposition. Sorry, very good. Alan, can you please? Sorry. I think the canine interruption is over. So yes, as these things have happened, the left has splintered into a range of positions, from opposition to the West to opposition to Russia and everything else in between. All too many issues have become entangled. What is the nature of imperialism? Who are the real imperialists? What is the legality, effectiveness, and real purpose of sanctions? What has been the role of NATO, both on an ongoing basis over the last 6 months, and of course, over the post-Cold War period, and of course, during the Cold War itself? What has been the role of fascists in the present conflict? Why have the whole people, namely the Russians, been demonized, Russians and their culture being demonized to levels unseen since the Second World War? What is the possibility of the extension of the logic of proxy wars from the war against Russia over Ukraine to another war against China over Taiwan? How is the current conflict changing? How is it already accelerating the ongoing transformation of the world order, its political and geopolitical economy, now solidifying into a clear anti-imperialist camp, which is getting more and more adherents? As during the pandemic, so also in the current conflict, the absence of a consistent left position opposing the war is being felt, and the right seems to be making much of the political running. This is costing not only the left, but the world as a whole, and the bill is mounting to existential proportions. Overcoming this limitation is the task which is long and hard. It is as long and as hard as its roots are long and deep. They go back to the post-Cold War moment, when substantial parts of the left was won over to Western imperialism, now festooned with banners of democracy and human rights, just as it was once festooned with banners of white man's burden and civilizing mission. It goes back further to the post-war moment, when so much of the social democracy compromised with imperialism, the compromises which were only deepened in the post-Cold War era with third-way social democracy. It goes back, of course, also to the splintering of the left over the Russian Revolution and over every other revolution, socialist revolution, that has occurred since. And further back to the formative difficulties of the Second International itself, when reformist tendencies arose and reacted with intellectual and political currents which narrowed and denatured the legacy of Marx and Engels, and refused to recognize the organic relation between capitalism and imperialism. So today, on the day when the day which is in between the anniversaries of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when we once again face the possibility of nuclear war, today, as the current war and its conduct deepens the economic crisis, in which the difficulties faced by the Western working class, deep and existential as they are actually dwarfed by the difficulties that are being faced by the vast majority of the people of the third world. And at a time when the prospects of dealing with the ecological emergency of of climate warming, of pollution and loss of biodiversity is receding ever further, this webinar is trying to make a start, however modest, in trying to overcome the divisions of the left in order that a substantial left position in politics may be felt around the world, one that is substantial and meaningful, opposed to the actual structures of power that are running the world and crashing it as we see today. Such a left, the importance of such a left is of course great the world over, but it is particularly great in the homelands of imperialism. So today we have many speakers who are going to be helping us begin to untangle this tangle. We have about 8 speakers. Hopefully all of them are here by now. And each speaker will have about 8 to 10 minutes each. I will introduce each of them in turn as they speak. And once they have finished speaking, we will have questions and answers, because I know many of you also have very substantial things to say. So we hope you will stay till the end. But before we begin, we will have a brief word from the International Manifesto Group Finance Committee. Alan, you have a minute, please.
Okay, in the chat, I've posted links to 4 ways that you can help us, which I hope you agree is necessary, given the unique role that we play and given the situation in the world, which we'll be hearing about from the speakers. So we classify these as 3 things that we do. One we call Know Better, and that's our news and analysis site, New Cold War. The other is Think Better, and that's the geopolitical economy research group site. And the third is the Manifesto Group site itself, which we've christened Do Better. There is also our YouTube channel, which you can see below that. What do we want you to do? Well, donate, write for us, help us translate, help us organize webinars like this, and therefore you can do 3 things. Each of these links on the Know Better, Think Better, Do Better channel has a donate, which you ideally would go and give us something every month. That's what we really need to stabilize ourselves. We welcome in some cases, very useful large donations that we have had, but to stabilize us, what we actually need is not a small number of large donations, but a large number of small but regular donations. And then finally, there are 3 ways to donate. One is through PayPal. I will say we are aware of what PayPal is doing that is wrong, and we're shifting to a different payment system, but please bear with us, we're stuck with that for now. There's Patreon, which is particularly accessible through the YouTube site. Either of those will help get to us, or simply contact us and we can help you donate. And we do urge people to volunteer. We've had a lot of very enthusiastic young volunteers from all over the world contributing to our work. In many ways, that's the reason we're able to do these webinars. So please don't hesitate to use the volunteer form on the Manifesto website and join us.
Thank you very much, Alan. So our first speaker will be John Ross. Let me just quickly introduce him. John Ross is Senior Fellow at the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at the Renmin University of China. Since 1992, John and the publication of John's Why Economic Reform Succeeded in China and Will Fail in Russia and Eastern Europe, he has authored over 500 articles on China's economy and geopolitical relations. He has more than 1 million followers on Weibo, the Chinese equivalent of Twitter. His articles on China's economy has won several prizes in China, and he is the author of 2 best-selling books in Chinese, The Great Chess Game and Don't Misunderstand China's Economy. His new book in English is called China's Great Road, Lessons for Marxist Theory and Socialist Perspectives. And I should say also that John was a major instigator for having this panel. So I think it's fitting that he should start us off. Please go ahead, John.
Okay, first I have to say, over the question of the war in Ukraine, I have never in my lifetime seen such confusion on the left on an issue which is actually so easy to understand. And it's almost like a scene on the left, a caricature of all the things which Marxism polemicized against, which is discussing a war in terms of who fired the first shot, who crossed whose borders, who is aggressive, who is defensive, etc. All the things which Marx and Lenin absolutely polemicized against and which lead people into confusion. Strange enough, on the question of war, both the bourgeoisie and Marxists agree who is the most profound thinker on this issue, which is Clausewitz. He's always recognized as most, in all places such as West Point and other things, as the most important writer on war. And he's also recognized by Marxism and by Marx, Engels, Lenin, and other writers on this. And the fundamental position of Clausewitz in his famous statement is very simple, which is war is the continuation of politics by other means. And once you get to the politics of what, you get rid of all this confusion about aggression, who fired the first shot, and all these types of things. Right. So what is the politics of this? The politics is extremely easy to understand. In fact, it was possible to predict this war a long time in advance. In fact, I when I was living in Moscow 30 years ago, predicted it 30 years ago. I can't prove that. You'll just have to take my word for it, because I was advising people there was going to be a civil war in Ukraine. I can prove it from the point of view of things which are written in 2014. And why is it possible to foresee it? Because it's the overlapping in the Ukraine of two questions. One is the expansion of NATO, which is the trigger for the war. And the second is the national question within Ukraine itself. Because it has to be understood that Ukraine is a multinational state. Anybody who looked at it for the last centuries knows perfectly well that there are two parts of Ukraine. There is roughly a West and North Ukraine, which was never part of Russia, didn't want to be part of Russia and doesn't want to be part of Russia. And the second is the south and the east of Ukraine, which for centuries has been part of Russia, speaks Russian, speaks religion, and in all many ethnic cases is Russian. Okay, now this is not unusual to have a multinational state. For example, Radica is at the moment sitting in one in Canada, where there is a national question within Canada, the multinational state. If the various nationalities within the state wish to maintain a multinational state, they're entirely willing to do so. And by very narrow majorities in Canada, for example, nevertheless, they've voted to maintain the multinational character of the state. Right, okay, right. Now, what is the case is, however, is of course that the aggressive policies of NATO, that is the expansion of NATO against all the promises which were made to Russia at the time of 1992, is the trigger for this war. Because this policy, which is an anti-Russian policy, is unacceptable to the population of the eastern Ukraine and the south of Ukraine, and as therefore this is what has precipitated the war. The reason for this expansion is also clear. It's internationally, incidentally, not only aimed against Russia, it's above all aimed against China. The United States faces a fundamental problem. In peaceful economic competition, it is being defeated by China. And if the present situation continues for some more years, not very many more years, maybe 10, 20 years, the United States will be defeated comprehensively by China. But the United States still maintains military dominance. Therefore, the risk, which the United States is prepared to do, is the US wishes to move issues from the economic terrain onto the military terrain. Whereas in the first Cold War with the Soviet Union, the United States didn't want a military confrontation with the USSR because they were approximately militarily equal. But the United States was always economically stronger than the USSR. Therefore, the United States attempted to shift the struggle onto the economic terrain. Even Reagan's military buildup in the 1980s was not actually aimed at having a war with the Soviet Union. It was aimed at putting economic pressure upon the Soviet Union. But the United States faces a problem. There's the good relations between China and Russia, which are not an alliance, but they have good relations, means that the United States is confronted not merely with a great economic power, which is in competition with it, which is China, but also with the only force in the world, which is in nuclear weapons, militarily equivalent to the United States. The United States, therefore, is intent upon breaking up these good relations with between Russia and the United States, Russia and China. There have been differences over how to do this. Some wish to do it by what, excuse me to use a slightly sexist term, might be called seduction. That was Kissinger's view. that is to promise things to Russia and to get them to break with China. That didn't work. The second view was to put massive pressure on Russia by expanding NATO and to force it to break off its relations with China. That was the goals of what the United States was doing. In this, the forces which wanted to apply pressure on this to the China are the ones which have come out dominant. And therefore, that is why they have carried out this pressure of bringing Ukraine into NATO. The fundamental thing which therefore brought things to a head is this attempt to bring Ukraine into NATO. And therefore, the first thing that anybody on the left has to do is to say this is the root cause of the war. There are other historical questions, the national question in Ukraine, etc. But this attempt to bring Ukraine into NATO is the fundamental cause of the war. The war could have been avoided if the United States had said, no, we are not going to bring Ukraine into NATO. There would not have been a war. That's very, very simple. Now, the Ukrainian state is talking about neutrality and other types of things, but unfortunately, it's too late and the war has broken out. Faced with these conditions, what is the position which the left has got to take? The first is not what it's doing at the present time or parts of it. I see people going on demonstrations raising the first thing as the slogan about Russian troops out. Well, we'll look at what were the consequences of an unequivocal withdrawal of Russian troops in a minute. But that's not the first thing. There is a very famous slogan of the West, of Marxists in the West by Karl Liebknecht, the main enemy is at home. So the people in the imperialist West, the first thing they should be doing is explaining this. The first thing is to explain the root cause of this war is the expansion of NATO. Now, that's the first thing which has to be campaigned for. The second question is the national question within Ukraine. It might have been possible before probably 2014 and certainly before the war, this war, to have maintained the multinational character of the Ukrainian state. And that should still be the question, of course. The people of the east and south of Ukraine and the people of the rest of Ukraine are entitled to self-determination. In the real world, with the war, with the massacres which are carried out by the Kiev regime against the east and south of Ukraine, in my opinion, there won't be a putting back together of the state anymore. There will be a separation, but it's still formally within the right of self-determination. That's what's got to be done. And this is simple. Again, to take the Canadian question. Quebec only just marginally voted against separation, even with the right of bilingual policy across the whole of Canada. If there had been the suppression of the French language, not merely in English-speaking Canada, but in Quebec, it would have voted for independence. But this is exactly what's happened in Ukraine. The suppression of the Russian-speaking parts of the population has led to a situation which is the split out of the state. So the second question that has to be said is the self-determination of all parts of Ukraine. And the third question is about the question of the Russian troops. The Russian troops, if they were withdrawn without a peace agreement, would lead to a massacre. It would be the military offensive of the Kiev regime against the population of South and East Ukraine. We've seen that. Therefore, one wants, of course, a peace settlement, more peace as rapidly and quickly as possible. That's the first thing. As part of that, certainly can be withdrawal of the Russian troops. But that is not the first slogan that needs to be put forward because it would lead to a fearful massacre under present circumstances. Therefore, the left position should be clear. One, Ukraine should not be part of NATO. NATO is responsible for this war. Secondly, the self-determination of all parts of Ukraine, which includes the south and eastern parts of Ukraine, recognizing in the present circumstances, unity could have been maintained, but now it will lead to separation. And thirdly, that there has to be a comprehensive peace agreement which maintains these principles. That's simple. That is the politics of the present situation, and that should determine the position on the war. Right, end. I'm 9 minutes, 57 seconds. Radical justice. Right, okay, end.
That's wonderful, John. Thank you. Excellent timing. Now, I'm going to have to ask for the forbearance of both the audience and my speakers. Kate Hudson sends her regrets. She would have been next. She just hadn't calculated on the demands on her time as head of CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. during these days, which are marking the anniversaries of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So, and I also see that Che is not here. So I was wondering if I could ask Jenny perhaps to go next. Jenny, is that okay? It's a bit of a demand on your time, but are you okay with that? We can't hear you.
Yes, I'm going to take a different quite a different angle, but
and that would be good. So let me just introduce you. I think this is the whole spirit of this debate. So let me just quickly introduce you, and so long as you're willing to go, that's great. And just so you know, after this, we will have. Let me see, where are my notes here? Yes, after this, we will have Steve, if that's okay with you, Steve Sweeney, then Camilla, then John Parker, and then we'll end with Demetrios. If Che shows up sometime before then, of course, we will include him in as well, just before Demetrios, perhaps. Okay, so to introduce Jenny, Jenny Clegg is an independent writer and researcher. She's former senior lecturer in the international studies and is a long-time China specialist. One of her more recent books is China's Global Strategy Towards a Multipolar World. And Jenny is also an activist in the peace and anti-war movements in Britain. So Jenny, please go ahead.
Thanks, Radhika. So I'm actually going to be focusing on the UN. Its principles are, of course, the bedrock of world peace. Both the sovereign equality of nations and territorial integrity, and its commitment of states to maintain friendly relations and to settle disputes by peaceful means so as not to endanger international peace and security. I would agree with John that NATO should be seen as the root cause of the war, but I'm not convinced that Russia had no other choices. Its actions, as I see it, are wrong and a massive miscalculation. The question that I think we should be engaging with is what kind of a world order will emerge from this war? And this means taking a long-term view and seeing the bigger picture, including China and the question of multipolarity. So the war clearly has a dual character. There's the war between Russia and the Ukraine, and there's also a proxy war. But this proxy war is not just between NATO and Russia, but is ultimately directed at China, identified as the greatest existential threat to the US. So we've had the recent NATO summit claiming that European and Indo-Pacific security are integrally connected, and the constant parallels between Russia, Ukraine, and China, Taiwan, talking about the risk of emboldening China if the West fails to stand up to Russia. So the Biden administration has recognized that China is too strong now to be beaten by the US on its own, hence the new emphasis on allies. And we can see how it's used the war to advance a Cold War style confrontation with the narrative of democracies against autocracies. The situation has been just too good to be true in getting NATO's European members and others like Japan to buckle down. So what kind of a future are the Ukrainians supposed to be fighting for, and what kind of order does the international peace movement stand for? I think that the UN Charter lies at the heart of the matter. Its principles are the result, as the Chinese would say, of much soul-searching, learning from the bitter experience of the two world wars. And the problem is the principles have not been sufficiently implemented. The UN was the outcome of the struggle, as we know, against worldwide fascism, an agreement of allies, the US, Britain, the Soviet Union, and yes, China, which had to be accepted on an equal basis in order to achieve victory in the East. For China, the UN Charter represents the basis of its status as a major world power. Under the terms agreed, China, the US, and the Soviet Union, which is also a Pacific power, were to be collectively responsible for the post-war order in the Pacific, and Taiwan was to be returned to China. This was the Yalta system of the East that never was, blocked by the Cold War. It's the root of the One China principle, and it defines China's end goal. with Taiwan's continued separation as a result of US arms and interference, exemplifying the US refusal to accept China as an equal. So the Chinese, I would say, did not fight the Japanese occupation at the cost of 15 to 20 million lives, just so that the US could decide where China's boundaries lie. Now, as I see it, this US war of democracies against autocracies is aimed at establishing a free and open, in quotes, rules-based order in which only democracies are considered legitimate. This is so as to legitimize Taiwan as an independent state and delegitimize China's claims. So we hear Western commentators on the Pelosi visit saying, oh, well, Taiwan can be seen as charting its own course closer to the West, just as Ukraine did. The biggest obstacle here is the UN, which recognizes the People's Republic of China as the only legitimate representative of China. This then is the main international contradiction, with the US-led Cold War-style democratic alliance strategy pitted against the UN order. So what about Russia? Will it return to the UN fold, withdrawing its troops and respecting Ukraine's territorial integrity? In effect, this is what it has signed up to at the BRICS summit, which included in its statement the following: we commit to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states, stress our commitment to the peaceful resolution of differences and disputes between countries through dialogue and consultation, and support all efforts conducive to the peaceful settlement of crises. Now, on multipolarity, I've heard people argue that we must defend Russia as a defense of multipolarity against US hegemony. Sure, both China and Russia seek a multipolar world, but they have very different ways of going about it. Russia repeatedly overrides the territorial integrity of others, and this creates potentially dangerous precedents for China itself seeking reunification. Of course, the relationship with Russia is important to China, and China maintains broad-based relations, but its assistance in the war is limited. It abstained, i.e. stopped short of supporting Russia in the UN vote deploring the action and calling for the withdrawal of troops. And it maintains relations with Ukraine and has given some aid. With both Russia and Europe weakening, the focus is shifting more broadly to the BRICS. These constitute only 25% of the world GDP, but in the next 10 years or 15 years, maybe this might be 40%, maybe challenging the G7. Multipolarity is about shifting the balance of power, but it's not just about power. It's also about the kind of order states create collectively to promote this shift through border development, which in turn requires peace and stability. Poles of power that are based on self-interest alone are bound to conflict. China has not stood aside in the war. In fact, it has taken an extremely important initiative, the Global Security Initiative. This aims to counter the new Cold War-style world confrontation. It opposes military blocs and fake multilateralism. It rejects war and sanctions in favor of peaceful dialogue. It reaffirms UN principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity, balanced together with the call for respect of security concerns of others. This is the concept of indivisible security, that one country should not seek to achieve its own security at the cost of another's. In conclusion, whilst calling for a ceasefire and negotiations to end the Ukraine war, the left also needs to ask itself what kind of world order will emerge from the Ukraine war. It needs to grasp how the US aims to build a new international order strong enough to resist China's reunification, and that the fight before us has been over 70 years in the making, the fight for the UN order. The left needs to stand by the One China principle and build a peace movement united in calling for indivisible and common security, so as once and for all to embed the principles of the UN Charter deep into the fabric of the international system. And in this, it needs to join with climate change activists and those fighting for equality and economic and social justice. I'll finish there.
Thank you very much, Jenny. That was a very good reminder of the profoundly imperialist roots of NATO and the critical issues about the international world order that we face today. Our next speaker is Steve Sweeney. Steve, I hope that's okay with you. Steve is the international editor of Britain's Morning Star newspaper. He visited Ukraine in April to report from the ground. However, he was forced to flee the country after being threatened and labeled a spy. Steve, I'm sure you will have many interesting things to tell us, so please go ahead.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invite to be here. I should underline that whilst I am the international editor of the Morning Star newspaper, I'm speaking to you today in a personal capacity. So I should make that very clear. The newspaper has its line on the crisis in Ukraine, and I wouldn't, which is reflected in its international pages and on the home pages. So what I say is my personal view, and that's based from as the introduction said, my time on the ground in the country. I think we should start by acknowledging, of course, that this is a proxy war being waged by NATO and by the imperialist forces in defense of a unipolar world aimed at Russia, but also behind Russia, China, as Jenny and other speakers and John have already said. I think it's also important to acknowledge that this conflict didn't start in February, but it started in 2014 with the Western-backed Maidan coup and the mobilization of the far right, which it is used and is still using as a proxy force, the so-called, or the new moderate rebels, the same that we saw in Syria, but also armed to the teeth by the West, which of course creates problems of its own for the future. And once the conflict has been resolved and we have a peace settlement, it comes to, one of the big questions is what happens to those Javelin missiles and all the other arms, the billions of dollars and billions of pounds, millions of pounds in arms that have found their way into the hands of not just the fascist and neo-Nazi forces, but some of those which have also found their way onto the black market and are appearing in the hand of jihadists in Ukraine, in Syria, sorry. So as the chair said, I was in Western Ukraine earlier this year. In April, I crossed, like many others did, I crossed from Poland. I took a coach from Warsaw. The border crossings were open still at that time, and I made my way into Lviv. I was on a coach with many others, but unlike them, they entered the country, and there was many people like them in military fatigues, and they entered armed to the teeth with weapons. But I went armed with a pen and a camera. And it is very clear which of those Ukraine is more afraid of, because the men and they were men in military fatigues, the man sitting opposite me who had a tattoo of a gun on his face, really set the tone really for the people that were entering the country. And they were met with a red carpet rolled out for them, and they were met by Ukrainian officials, and of course they were eventually, some of those that were either posing as humanitarian aid workers or others, but many of them have made their way to the front line, heeding the call of Zelensky as part of this international force. But for me, it wasn't quite that. I didn't get quite that welcome. I was immediately accosted by Ukrainian forces. I was told that I was a communist, which I am. I wholeheartedly admit to being a communist, and but also that I would be treated as a spy. And they said that I would be detained, I would be tortured, and one of the people that spoke to me implied that I would be executed. Now, of course, I managed to escape from the country. I managed to cross back into Poland with a group of refugees, and I was given a pack with water and food in, and I just kept quiet and got back across the border. But I think what it said very clearly was, that there was an attempt to control the media narrative, and I'll speak about that a little bit later. But I did speak to a large number of people in Lviv, and also I spoke to some in Warsaw, and all of them, I spoke to scores of people, and all of them, testimony after testimony, told me that the Ukrainian armed forces were storing military equipment. They were having and soldiers that were being housed in schools, in hospitals and residential areas. One woman, and I'll talk about the Amnesty report in a little bit too, but one woman who told me, she pointed to a picture of a photograph of her flat in Mariupol, or just outside Mariupol, and it was destroyed, and she pointed at it and she said, Azov did this. And she and another friend of hers told me that for 8 years they have been terrorized by far-right forces, and they actually welcomed Russian troops into that area, into the Donbas region and to the east of Ukraine. They were welcomed because they were the ones that were bringing water, medical supplies, and helping them when Ukraine's armed forces were threatening to shoot them. And they tried many times to leave Mariupol, but they said they were held hostage, and they said it was Ukraine's armed forces that threatened to shoot them. So this is who they were afraid of. And there's been this tightness, this attempt to control the narrative. We've seen the BBC, CNN, ITV, Channel 4, The Times, The Telegraph, The Guardian producing identical reports from, that they say are from the ground, but mainly they're from Lviv and Kiev. Whereas those who are close to reporting the truth, people like Eva Bartlett, who's doing some fantastic work in the Donbass at the moment, reporting on the war crimes that are being committed there, the use of these cluster munitions, banned cluster munitions, petrol bombs. And she's been placed on a kill list, the Peacemakers kill list, which I'm sure everybody will be aware of. But what they may not be aware of is that a story that I broke in the Morning Star just last week, that we uncovered a similar kill list that is operating from an office in London. And close to Hyde Park, it's Molfar, its name is. It's linked to the Ukrainian government, their digital transformation ministry. The head of PR from Molfar was joined them from Ukraine's Foreign Affairs Ministry, and it's of course supported by USAID and Pinkerton. It lists as one of its clients the notorious US anti-working class, anti-trade union intelligence agency, and they've been publishing lists of undesirables, photographs, and the names and the addresses and the details of children, younger, as young as sort of, or certainly under the age of 18, some over the age of 18. So there's a real attempt to control the narrative and to frighten those into who are getting close to the truth on the ground. We saw just last week the release of the Amnesty International report, which said that confirmed actually what many of us have been saying on the ground. They confirmed that the Ukrainian armed forces have been placing military hardware in schools, hospitals and residential areas, placing them at risk. And of course they faced a backlash from the mainstream press. The Times accused them of being Putin apologists, shameful Putin apologists. In the Telegraph they said that they were they were part of the extreme left. They blocked them in with Stop the War, and they're a de facto wing of Stop the War, as though Stop the War is some kind of organization that should be opposed, because now all of us and all of the people that have been calling for peace are branded Putin apologists. And of course Amnesty, I think most of us here will probably know the history of Amnesty International. They're, in my view, one of the most craven bootlickers of US imperialism, along with the other human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch. So when they're speaking out about this thing, I think it gives it extra credence. But what we have heard is that the organization inside Ukraine, the Amnesty's Kiev-based wing, spent months suppressing that report and trying to get it blocked because it's vindicated and it's told the truth about what's happening in there. Now, I'm going to, of course, somebody's just mentioned in the chat quite rightly, and I've written about this, Alina Lipp, the German journalist who's again been based in the Donbass region, faces 3 years in prison in Germany for her reporting from the area. So what the left must do as well, of course, is support those of people on the ground that are supporting or reporting the truth. The people that I spoke to begged me. They know what's happening. They know the narrative that's being spun out, and they begged me and they begged other people to tell their stories. And it's their voices that are missing from the narrative, and it's their story that simply isn't being told. Now, I've got 1 minute left, and I'll just address the issue of Russian troops out as a slogan that has been raised across the movement. Now, for me, this is a simplistic and, again, a problematic slogan. It's not too different from the line of the Western imperialist powers who also say this, but what does it mean? And we do have some idea of what it means from and what it would look like from the past 8 years in the Donbass region, which has seen more than 8,000 civilians being killed by far-right forces, which is right now being shelled with banned cluster munitions. And as John, I think, said, and other speakers will rightly say as well, is that a withdrawal of this kind would lead to a massacre of Russian speakers in those areas by a brutal far-right force, and we must oppose that, I think. As in any conflict, there's going to be a negotiated solution. The left, of course, must should stand for that, and it should stand for peace. But peace isn't abstract in this scenario. What does that peace look like? What does it mean? Jenny spoke about the new world order that emerges from this, which I think is really what's at stake. And I think on the left we should be absolutely clear that peace is impossible as long as NATO exists. Now, the former Bolivian leader Evo Morales, he's issued a call for an anti-NATO alliance, and I think that we should heed that call. And for progressive forces, the demands I think John listed for supporting the people in the Donbass region and their rights for autonomy, I think is something that, of course, we should support from the left. We should support for a peaceful solution. But just to close, I think that all progressive forces now must unite and agitate for the disbandment of NATO. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve, for that riveting combination of reportage and analysis, and we really appreciate it. I think you raised some fundamental questions, particularly about NATO as well, just as Jenny had in a different way. Our next speaker is Camilla Escalante. Camilla is the woman behind Causation News, a media outlet which is based in Bolivia. She's also known for her correspondence work reporting around Latin America. And she's also Latin American correspondent for Press TV. Camilla's family are FMLN revolutionary former combatants. She was previously based in Quito, Havana, and Caracas. She's currently based in Tropico of Cochabamba and reporting on the campesino movements across the continent. She will be on the ground covering this is slightly dated. So she will be on the ground covering the elections in Brazil. So Camilla, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Radhika. Thank you for the invitation. And yes, I'll be in Brazil covering the elections. We are no longer, I'm no longer based in the Tropico of Cochabamba. We've moved this year to La Paz to be sort of closer to, first of all, the social movements here, but also this is sort of the seat of government, and we have a lot of opportunities to cover a lot of great things here in La Paz, but we're still based in Bolivia. I wanted to, inspired by what Steve said, yesterday we celebrated 197 years of independence here in Bolivia, and we heard the speech by President Luis Arce in Sucre, which is actually the capital of Bolivia. And he made some remarks about the conflict and the need for peace in the world right now. But he said that there cannot be peace so long as we have this history that is ongoing of foreign interventions, of interventionist wars, of blockades and sanctions that have been painful to humanity, that we put so much weight, and there's so much propaganda and discourse around the conflict taking place in Ukraine, and of course, all of the harms and violence that people are suffering and living through. But in fact, we have been plagued with intervention and war and even death and bombings right here in our lands and territories in a scramble for resources from the imperialists. And this is ongoing. This has been nonstop, and it didn't begin when this military operation began in February of this year. So things couldn't be clearer than they are today here, where we are in Latin America. They've been extraordinarily clear over the last 6 months on the left in Latin America and in the last 2 years. And, I think we can't wait until the start of the next war to call into question some of the so-called leftists who have stood by the imperialist powers of our world and against the global majority when this special operation began. I think it's highly suspicious that there continue to be leftists in the world, in the global north, who fail to see that the global majority has a distinct position from them on this issue. They have dismissed the positions of anti-imperialist parties, of the social movements, and of our leaders of the revolutions here in Latin America and the Caribbean, thinking that they have a better position. When it's we here in the global South, in Latin America and the Caribbean, where I'm speaking, who are fighting in defense of our natural resources, against imperialist plunder, amid everything that's going on. And that's becoming clearer and clearer by the day. Leaders such as Evo Morales and President Nicolas Maduro were the first out the gates to call for an end to imperialist NATO expansion and have warned of the dangers of these extremist far-right white supremacist Nazi forces that are being defended and platformed and protected and uplifted by European countries in North America, and imperialists and fascists all over the world. So I would say that there is, in fact, a consistent left position here in Latin America, in contrast with, what Radhika has said, how we framed it, that there lacks a position that is consistent and coherent in the global north. That position here in Latin America continues to be against NATO imperialist expansion, against new manufactured pretexts for encroaching on our territories with new US military bases, the United States military bases, and Southcom, its Southern Command here within Latin America and the Caribbean, is the representation of NATO on our continent, and it has the most bases of any country. Russia and China, nor any other country in the world has a presence anywhere remotely comparable to what the United States has all around our territory, particularly in Colombia, where there are 7 US military bases active right now. Today, Colombia, of course, is celebrating the inauguration of Gustavo Petro and Francia Marquez. And it's a very important date, a very momentous time for us. And it's a huge achievement for the people of Colombia and Latin America to see Iván Duque out the door today. But that's because Iván Duque is bringing NATO and the US and military forces to our continent to set up permanently. It's going to be very difficult to get rid of them. And our position is also against additional plundering of our natural resources and the dismantling and privatization of our strategic nationalized industries. Juan Ramon Quintana was a former minister of the Evo Morales government. And he gave a talk here. He's given several talks to try to help bring clarity to the situation here to the social movements in Bolivia since the conflict began. And he said the West, the European Union, the United States, NATO, what they're trying to do is survive through their political, economic, financial, and cultural crisis, because the West has not given any answer to humanity. The West today is synonymous with war, destruction, weapons, atomic arsenals. What is the culture of the West, he asked. We're coming from 500 years of mutilating our ears, cutting off our noses, cutting off our hands, dismembering us, leaving horses to dismember us. That's what the left has left with us, comrades. And it is a culture of destroying nature, Mother Earth, and it doesn't cease. It doesn't cease in its compulsive materialistic appetite to wage war to appropriate other people's strategic resources. And so Russia and China are simply not coming for our resources. There do exist private investment projects and extractivist projects involving companies from these countries. It's absurd to point this out given the massive presence of Canadian, US, and European mining companies, and given the long list of blatant meddling in internal affairs of the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, and the well-documented coups and in their funding of political and opposition groups, which is ongoing. There's, countless instances can be named of this in recent history, and it continues today. And I think it's just very, blatantly obvious, like all that has happened with the energy crisis and the United States descending on Caracas once again, and every single other country that has energy, Suriname, Trinidad and Tobago, and Guyana, and begging and demanding and trying to barter for access to our resources. It's very clear what this is all about. This is a scrambling for, new ways, new pretexts being created to come in and swoop up our resources. And if you listen to any of the press conferences, the speaking events, and the interviews or statements of the Southcom commander, General Laura Richardson, you'll see that they're very clear about their fascination and their obsession with our natural minerals, with our rocks, with everything we have here, and that we have to offer, and what they still continue to consider their backyard. And so we're seeing here in Latin America a witch hunt in our region, in which Washington has said either they're with NATO or the West and the US, or they're against us. That is the choice that they're giving us. And so anyone who, attempts to be so-called neutral here is being put into the category of pro-Russia, and we are subject to US blackmail and intimidation and pressure here. And, that blackmail and intimidation, it takes the form of blocking loans, of imposing new additional sanctions, as has been waged against the countries that are closest to Russia and China, namely Nicaragua and Venezuela. And so, no one is sanctioning the US or the EU for their plundering wars or their, violent and, crimes against humanity and war crimes in the Middle East. And so beyond inflation and the loss of access to inputs for production, the various ways in which our productive sectors and industries are being affected here, and all the harsh economic effects on the working class of the Caribbean and Latin America, and how difficult it is for people to access and afford fuel and gas and food. We face the real threat of increased militarization and hostility towards our peoples and governments, because we're rejecting these North American imperialist NATO policies. And again, it's no coincidence that we're seeing increased hostility and new attempts at destabilization against those countries who are choosing to reject the NATO propaganda and partner with and develop with and move forward and advance with China and Russia. And so, the most important consequence of this conflict for our region is this greater pressure for the grab of our natural strategic resources, our oil, our gas, our minerals, our lithium. And they couldn't be more overt about it. And I think that this is radicalizing people here. People here already began, when this conflict broke out, hearing from our leaders, President Nicolas Maduro, Evo Morales, President Luis Arce, but it's becoming more and more clear what this is about. This is not about so-called, democracy or human rights or any of the sort. Sorry, I'm seeing someone's full screen here, but it is about NATO expansion into other territories and trying to come around and take things that don't belong to them and destine us to servitude and just an absolute terror and tyranny of the imperialist North being imposed on the peoples of the global South. And I think it's being rejected. And I think the people of the North need to understand why it's being rejected and why this position is becoming so common here in Latin America and throughout the global North. Thank you so much, Radhika.
Thank you. I was just busy dealing with that intruder. Okay, thank you so much. And I think it was probably your extremely excellent analysis, I think, and your excellent delivery of it that probably prompted her to try and do something. Anyway, we have two more speakers. I will next go to John Parker and then followed by Demetrios. So John Parker was a candidate for the US Senate in the June 7th election. He was his primary election, I should say. He has recently returned from Russia and the Donbas region where he went on a fact-finding mission to expose US and NATO war aims and alliances in the region. John has received an award for solidarity at the Luhansk Regional Administration Building from the chairman of the government of the Luhansk People's Republic, Sergei Kozlov. He's the coordinator of the Harriet Tubman Center for Social Justice, and he's on the organizing committee of the Socialist Unity Party. So, John, please go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, John and Steve and Camilla covered a lot of great stuff, so I'm just going to deal with one topic, the fascism in Ukraine. You know, Nazism in Ukraine is in fact a real problem. But in order to come to that conclusion, you need to understand that corporate media is unreliable. Just check the so-called newspapers of record, the New York Times coverage in 1915 of the Lusitania incident, our articles that were outright lies about the Gulf of Tonkin and Iraq weapons of mass destruction, both of which led the US into wars that eventually killed millions. What did the New York Times, Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, TikTok, and out of Ukraine, Kiev Independent and the Euromaidan Press have in common? They're all either funded by or staffed with Western and US intelligence members pushing the US narrative about the war in Ukraine, two of which are the Atlantic Council and the NATO's Atlantic Council and the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Now, this must be considered when analyzing US imperialism's current attacks on China or this proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. When I first arrived in Lugansk in the Donbas region, I participated in a large religious conference of heads of the Muslim, Jewish, Christian Orthodox religions representing the Donbas regions and Russia. The conference was titled Traditional Religions of Donbass Against Extremism and Neo-Nazism. They apparently thought it was a problem and provided testimony to that frightful fact. When talking to socialists in the Lugansk region, or socialists or communists in Russia, they're all agreed and can point to numerous examples of the growth of fascism in Ukraine and how it's disseminating not only in Ukraine, but around the world. Now, we saw the example of that in Buffalo recently with the killing of 10 Black people in a supermarket by a white supremacist wearing the emblem of the Azov Battalion. Now, his influence can be traced directly to the Azov Battalion. This dissemination the socialists talk about in Lugansk and Russia was documented by Time magazine in 2019 in an article titled Like, Share, Recruit: How a White Supremacist Militia Uses Facebook to Radicalize and Train New Members. Now I'm going to quote the article. It said, outside Ukraine, Azov occupies a central role in a network of extremist groups stretching from California across Europe to New Zealand, according to law enforcement officials on 3 continents. And it acts as a magnet for young men eager for combat experience. Ali Soufan, a security consultant and former FBI agent who has studied Azov, estimates that more than 17,000 foreign fighters have come to Ukraine over the past 6 years from 50 countries. Now, last week, it took me just about 3 clicks on Facebook to get to the recruiting video of Azov Battalion, which is officially part of the military, the neo-Nazis in Ukraine. Just 3 clicks on Facebook to get to their recruiting thing on YouTube. Now, here's what a Lugansk militia soldier had to say that I interviewed about the Nazi infestation in Ukraine. And I asked him how much of the Ukraine military is really led by Nazis. And he said, well, you can't say exactly because those forces began to create their own battalions in 2014, but then they became part of the official military and very much a part of the police, security, military, Ministry of Weapons. They got the opportunity to grow in these structures, and some became very important figures in state politics, and they're all well integrated. In every battalion and every force, there are Nazis. Now, that's what this soldier who was part of the Lugansk People's Militia had to say. Now, that sounds like a problem to me. So maybe the left in the United States and Europe should not be so dismissive of the Russian claims of Nazis at their borders. a country which sacrificed 27 million lives to stop the fascists during World War II. I didn't even mention that fact that we found in one of the regions in Lugansk, a wall with a swastika and the Sonorand, or the Black Sun, and some other Nazi symbols where the Ukrainian had just vacated the Ukrainian military. And when we add the fact that for the last 8 years, the Donbass region was under the fire of torture, rape, and bombings for 8 years since the Nazi-led military dominated the fighting in that region. And the fact that on February 22nd, over 100,000 Ukrainian troops were ready to finish the job and presented a humanitarian crisis of threatened genocide. Not only did the people of the Donbass region have the right to officially plead for the help of the Russian government to stop that genocide, the Russian government had a responsibility to stop that genocide, and also the existential threat at their borders with a country willing to become a NATO member state, willing to accept nuclear weapons that are able to be launched within reach of Moscow in just 5 minutes. And these weapons were in a state with a military led by neo-Nazis. Now, we must understand that the opposing views to the US narrative about this war has been silenced in Ukraine by criminalizing all socialist and communist parties and the weekly jailing of journalists daring to challenge that narrative. And in regard to comparison of Russia, quote, taking over countries versus the millions upon millions killed from NATO's wars on former Yugoslavia, bombing thousands of homes, the US and NATO wars of Vietnam, Korea, the 500,000 children killed in Iraq, and the turning of Libya now into a state that now has slavery against dark-skinned African people. And the crippling sanctions Camilla spoke about, they're not being done by Russia, which is actually helping to protect Bolivia, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and other developing countries from the war and economic war by the United States. In the Ukraine, it started before 2014, but in 2004, in a shockingly honest 2004 report titled US Campaign Behind the Turmoil in Kiev, Britain's established newspaper, The Guardian, admitted that the Orange Revolution was an American creation. They said, quote, a sophisticated and brilliantly conceived exercise in Western branding and mass marketing, bankrolled with at least 14 million by the US government. That's what the National Endowment for Democracy and the other intelligence agencies of the CIA and the US government have been doing in Ukraine. Now, the political left movement in the United States and Europe has a big problem that comes from a cultural disease developed especially by US capitalism's history of racism. Not only is there class bias, but the added dehumanization with all its arrogant trappings intrinsic to the system of racism carries over to anyone deemed as the other. In the US, the other is usually anyone who is non-white and is therefore not taken as seriously, not as believable, not as legitimate and reliable a source of information, and definitely not due as much empathy. This is how white supremacy carries over, even to other white people deemed as the other. And we are told by the US government who the latest other is. Sometimes it's the Iraqis and their leaders, or it's the Syrians and their leadership, or the Libyans and their leadership. Hell, after the rape and murder and desecration of Muammar Gaddafi's body, something that would never be tolerated in the least of any European or US head of state, then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton got away with joking about the killing. Because Gaddafi was the other, and any information coming out of Libya by an official or unofficial news service would be deemed unreliable here during the NATO targeting of that country. Any news coming from the former Yugoslavia during the NATO war in 1999 from Milosevic or news services would not be taken seriously. Any news negating or just challenging the New York Times articles or so-called proof from Amnesty International about the babies being thrown from incubators or weapons of mass destruction was deemed as unreliable if it came from a government or non-government news agency in Iraq, because that was the news of the other, the new Black people that can't be trusted. This is why the sources of information coming directly from white supremacist neo-Nazi military organizations in Ukraine is more trusted than those in the Donbass region, because the people of Donbass and Lugansk and Donetsk are the other. My friends from Borotba, who the left refuses to even acknowledge their existence, a socialist organization there in Lugansk, nor even mention them, are part of the other. The Communist Party of the Russian Federation, the other. The 82-year-old woman in Donbass region of Rubizny, I interviewed at the shelter there, who was crying over the bombing of her home by the Ukrainian tanks and the loss of all her belongings, and the woman just south of there in Krymskoye, I interviewed, who identified the Idar battalion as their occupiers, another neo-Nazi grouping. They're the other. The entire political leadership in Lugansk, the religious community, the Lugansk People's Militia members, all the other, and deserving of neither an ear nor a heart for empathy. That's the problem. And we have to recognize that subjective disease plaguing our movement in the US and Europe, and those in the leadership of the US and European anti-war movement whose ethnicity allows them to receive a few extra benefits from white supremacy that non-white folks do not receive. They especially must be vigilant and check that their organization's politics, even if once was anti-imperialist, has not become infected by the arrogance toward and dehumanizing of the other. Thanks. Sorry for going too long there.
Thank you, John. Once again, that was really riveting, and you had us all listening very hard. So that was really great. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. I should say, as we go to our last speaker, Demetrios Konstantakopoulos, that I know from the lively chat that I've seen, there will be lots of questions. So the way we will conduct the question and answer session is, I would request everybody who has a question to raise their hand using the raise hand function. And I will take about 2 or 3 questions in turn, and we will see how far we can go, how long people want to stay and discuss. So let me now introduce our last speaker. Demetrios Konstantakopoulos is a journalist and writer specialized in international policy. He's the author of several books on the Eastern Mediterranean, its geopolitics, including that affecting Cyprus. He has worked at the office of the Greek Prime Minister Andreas Papandreou on East-West relations and arms control from 85 to 88, and as the chief correspondent, and he has been a member of the Secretariat of the Central Committee of Syriza, which he quit in 2015. Today, he is the coordinator of the Delphi Initiative, which is a news press which you can find at www.defenddemocracy.press. www.defenddemocracy.press. So Demetrios, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Radhika. Good morning and good evening to everybody. I am afraid that my internet connection here is a little bit disturbed because I'm in a small Aegean island and things are somehow difficult. If my connection is cut, I will cut at least my image so you can hear me. So first of all, I want to say the following, man. The reactions we have seen to Russian military intervention in Ukraine since six months now are quite informative about what is happening with democracy, I would say, in the West itself. Because we have seen for the first time since the Roma, for example, and the persecution of the Romans and of the Jews, a general racist persecution of everything Russian, including great Russian composers and writers, which is rather ridiculous. We have seen a wave of neo-McCarthyism in the whole West. And so that makes into doubt the arguments of the West that this is a struggle between democracy and autocracy. And to be more precise about this argument, we have seen what kind of democracy destroyed at least half a dozen countries. We have seen also what would mean a victory of the West over Russia we have seen this during the 90s. I think you all remember that Boris Yeltsin, in order to proceed with the entering of the capitalist relations of production and distribution and the looting of the Soviet public property in Russia, with the whole support and the encouragement of the United States, he bombed Parliament in October 1993. This is the kind of democracy that the West means to impose on Russia, and we see it in Ukraine, where all opposition parties are forbidden and where a very authoritarian regime has been established. And there is a question. Why, for example, such moral outrage about Russia's intervention in Ukraine? We did not see anything like that when, for example, NATO, with France in its forefront, has intervened, has destroyed one of the more prosperous and progressive African and Middle Eastern countries, Libya. We have not seen any moral outrage in half a dozen such interventions in the whole of the Middle East and in Yugoslavia. We have not seen also such outrage when the European Union and the IMF intervened and destroyed with economic means one member of the European Union and NATO, that is my country, Greece. If they impose such a regime inside their own ranks, one can imagine what would happen if they would win over Russia in what amounts to a sui generis world war. Sui generis because there is not a frontal clash between the two camps, but in all other aspects, it's really a world war. Now, I don't know if this was a mistaken response of Russia or not. Maybe it was, maybe it was not. This is irrelevant to our discussion. And in reality, the crisis in Ukraine began in 2014, and I did not see any reaction to the fact that a war is continuing in Donbass for 7 years now. And some people also criticize the Russian leadership not for intervening, but for not intervening earlier, when it could solve the problem much easier. So if you look to this conflict, you can see three, so to say, conflicts, the one hidden into the other, like the Russian matryoshkas. The core conflict is Donbass conflict. And I must say at this point that we consider Ukraine and Russia as two separate countries. As a matter of fact, they have been for a long time part of the same country. There is an aspect of civil war in what is happening now in Ukraine. And the Soviet Union was dissolved in dubious circumstances of dubious legitimacy, and even the frontiers of those countries were drawn without taking into account the right of nations to self-determination, because both Donbass and Crimea are inhabited by a clear Russian majority, Russian ethnic majority. So why they had to adhere to Ukraine? Nobody asked their citizens. Anyway, their citizens accepted this fact, and Russia accepted this fact until 2014, when they saw a coup d'etat in Kiev threatening them directly, not only in their national rights. They understood that this was also a social offensive. The revolt of the Donbass inhabitants was also a social one. They kicked out their oligarchs, and they tried to run themselves to their region and their economies. And this is unfortunately a badly known aspect of the things in the West. Even if you consider that Russia is aggressive against Ukraine, there is another problem, that there is a much bigger threat against Russia from NATO itself. And this is, we have enough elements. I don't think it is necessary to repeat that. Now in this discussion, that NATO has promised not to extend, it is extending all the time. Now it wants to go to the Pacific Ocean, and only a stupid person can, or a dishonest person can buy the argument that it is doing this for defensive reasons. So Russia has suffered 13 or maybe more invasions from the West through Belarus and Ukraine in the last 3 centuries, including Napoleon's war against it and Hitler's war against it. I think it would be foolish for a Russian general not to take this into account. We can, of course, say whatever we want from far away, but this is the reality of the situation. Now, some people say that after all, the left has not to choose between 2 imperialisms. But this is a wrong comparison with the First World War, because there we had really the advanced capitalist countries, the imperialist countries, were divided into 2 blocks. Now what we have is that the West, we have the phenomenon of a kind of hyper-imperialism, like super-imperialism, like Karl Kautsky has proposed, but at the time he proposed it, his idea did not come true. Now it is coming true. We have the so-called collective West, which has, first of all, it has disciplined all its states, and even states which were neutral and opposed to the American policy, like France and Sweden, and they are all together against Russia. And they want what they want. They tell us what they want by their words and their actions. They want a regime change in Russia. And now I may ask the question, irrespective of what is going on in Ukraine, is it the interest of Russians and Ukrainians to see a regime change in Russia, the dissolution of the Russian Federation into small parts, as Brzezinski has proposed in his famous book, and a further isolation of China, and then the repetition of the same scenario in China, or with a war, a great war against Iran in the Middle East, because those which will be is going to win, which I doubt very much, by the way, is it will be a global disaster, a disaster for the Ukrainian people, a disaster for the Russian people, and a disaster for the whole of humanity. This is why the left cannot endorse this war, not because it likes invasions or military interventions, which are anyway, they are happening much more often on the initiative of Western countries. See any moral outrage, even from the West, as I told you before, when they intervened in Libya, in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, etc. 2 months ago, Afghanistan is a country which is threatened by decided to confiscate the what this country has, the small means it has in Western banks as a reparation for the victims of September 11th. This is the Western humanism, which is anyway, we know it for 500 years. There is no reason to pretend that there is such a thing. Now, I'm afraid that the Western left has known a moment of bankruptcy up to now, and if the situation is continuing, it will be very dangerous. Because, listen, even if we dismiss all the Russian arguments, arming Ukraine and trying to overthrow the Russian regime means three things. First, we run the risk of a nuclear war by accident, by miscalculation, or by provocation. When I mean provocation, when I say provocation, I mean that there is an extremist nucleus inside the Western establishment. In my opinion, but of course there is no proof of that, if the COVID was leaked by an American biotechnology laboratory, as Jeffrey Sachs, not any strange person, is claiming, then this has been, but if it was done in purpose, it has been the work of a Black International working inside the Western system as a fraction which is going to world war and to chaos worldwide. So there are such forces in the West, and we must not dismiss them. I don't know what is happening in Russia and in China, but I cannot exclude that they will at some time appear there, because the competition is sometimes making the two competing forces similar. So even when the left says no to the war, but it begins explaining how the Putin's regime is criminal and barbarian, and what is Bush's regime, what is Trump's regime, what is Nicolas Sarkozy's regime, then we have to treat all of them criminal and barbarians, or we have to be more political. In fact, I'm afraid that the left, a part of the left is siding with its own imperialism, as it has done many times in the past, and another part is just afraid of spelling things out. The second consequence of the continuation of this world war, sui generis world war, is that we lose every hope of stopping climate change. This is the new fact which we don't take into account, the new factor which we don't take into account. We believe that our world will last forever. We are waging struggles to share its resources, to dominate, things like that. But this world cannot exist for much longer. I mean, the humanity, the world will make unsustainable the continuation of human life. We must stop climate crisis. But to stop climate crisis, first of all, we need to have a climate of international cooperation.
Demetrios, if I may request you to wrap up, please.
Yes, I will make a synthesis. So we see even now, as a result of the war and the sanctions and the counter sanctions, we see European states making many steps backwards towards in the climatic change thing by importing LNG, by accelerating fossil fuel researches, etc. The third thing is that the continuation of this war is a threat to the democratic, to what has left of democratic atmosphere in our own countries, in the Western countries, I mean. And some people, now we see the crisis already happening in 4 European countries, and we will see much more coming in the next months. So some people are joyful about this because they see that the West is going to be defeated, etc. The West is not going to be defeated automatically. I mean, and here the role of the left is crucial. We see in Sri Lanka, for example. In Sri Lanka, there was a revolt, there was a crisis, there was a revolt, but the result was rather a more pro-American, pro-IMF administration. So for the left, for the Western left, it is a very critical moment. If it does not want that this crisis leads to the rise of far-right forces and neo-fascist forces in Europe and in the United States, it has to appear. And in order to appear, it has, first of all, to have a concrete policy on Ukraine. And this concrete policy has to include, in my opinion, 4 points. The one is to call, of course, for a ceasefire and negotiations, to call also for the lifting of sanctions, which are harming, by the way, more Western Europe than Russia itself, and to the arming of the Ukraine. So we have a freezing of the situation and to try to find a solution, a solution outside the war scenarios. There is no, in my opinion, other possible alternative. And if the left does not find the courage to do it in the West, then there will be no left and no democracy, and it will be very dangerous for the whole world, because the West, and this is the difference with the Second World War, there is no possibility of winning a world war for any of the camps. A world war in the present conditions will mean the destruction of the whole of humanity. We have signed, and Radica also signed, an appeal, an international appeal to stop the war and lift the sanctions immediately. I will put it to you through the chat function, because I don't know how to share my screen. And we invite all of you, if you wish to sign it, it is remaining open to signature. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Demetrios. As you can see from the chat, your speech was much appreciated and forms a very fitting conclusion to the formal presentation part of today's webinar. We are now open for questions. So the way we will do it is, please use the raise hand function, which you may find independently or under the reactions tab below. And we will take, say, 3 questions to begin with, and then I will request any of the speakers who want to respond to then raise their hands. Once that is done, we will take another round of questions. And we'll see how far people want to go. Let's say we will end in about half an hour, maybe 40 minutes. Okay, so I have John McGrath, Rafael, Escalante, I hope I got it right, and Yuri. So John, please go ahead.
Yes, I hope everybody...
Sorry, one thing before you start. Please try to keep your questions brief and to the point. Obviously, I don't want to prevent you from giving some context, but please bear that in mind. Thank you. Please go ahead, John.
I hope everybody can hear me. I enjoyed the presentation. My question, if anyone wants to answer, is how can we unpopularize the war in Ukraine within NATO countries? I say this as a US citizen living in the UK, where the support is very high, both politically and in the population. I know it might be different in other countries like Italy and Greece and whatnot, and certainly in the Southern Hemisphere. But within countries that are supporting arming Ukraine, how can we help change that opinion in the population? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Rafael, please.
Yes, hello to everybody. A warm hello from Montreal, Canada. My name is Rafael. I'm linked to the newspaper called L'Autre Journal, the other newspaper, which brings an heterodox thinking. So my question, my statement is, would the answer for the left movement could be only to ask Ukraine to withdraw from NATO, and as Russia asked for many years? That's my question. That's my statement.
Thank you. And Yuri.
Thank you, Professor, and apologies for the insults to Slavoj Žižek, and apologies for dropping the F-bomb. Anywho, my quick questions, particularly to Ms. Escalante, because I really liked her speech, but the entire panel could comment on this, is why do you think we've gone to a point where even when we had a very strong anti-communist left movement, why have we gotten to this point where once upon a time you could be against the Vietnam War, you could be against most of what most U.S. aggressions in Latin America, and can go marching against the Second Iraq War, saying no war for oil, but there is no war for oil on Venezuela. There is no stop the Western Gulf War on Syria like there is for Yemen, and then the same applies for yours truly, Ukraine. Why have we shifted so badly to that?
Thank you, Yuri. So this is the first round of questions, and I will just add one quick question that somebody has requested me to ask on the chat, which is to Jenny. Jenny, the question is, what alternative do you believe Russia has as an alternative to military action in the present circumstance? So these are the questions. If I may request the speakers to please let me know if they want to respond. Steve, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I just wanted to, I'll be very brief. I just wanted to touch on the point that was made about how do we unpopularize the war in Britain, I think was the question. I don't think the war is particularly popular in Britain, to be perfectly honest with you. We saw a demonstration. There's an organization called Solidarity or the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign, which organized a demonstration, I think maybe 2 months ago now, or a few weeks ago now, that took to the streets of London demanding demanding more arms for Ukraine. People were horrified when they saw this, actually. They were horrified when they heard the chants of arm Ukraine, which were being made exactly the same time that Boris Johnson was in Kiev visiting President Zelensky to do just that. So that they're swinging full behind the government position. You know, what can they do more? More arms to Ukraine? I'm not entirely sure. And they opposed, this agitation for peace. So that fell flat. And the unions certainly aren't supporting that. But we can unpopularize it in the same way that it has been unpopularized in Greece and in Italy, where there have been national strikes by from the trade unions there, under the slogan in Italy particularly of lower your guns, raise our wages. Now people are starting to make that connection because they're struggling, as I said in my speech, to put food on the table, and they're struggling when their union rights are being stripped away as well, which is why we're seeing this huge wave of strike action. So we need to popularize that. The other demands I think that we can make again are for an end to sanctions on Ukraine, on Russia. I mean, the sanctions are having a sort of a rebound effect in that they're trashing the economies of the Eurozone. They're trashing the US economy, the British economy. We're seeing record inflation. People, there's talk of recession in Britain. There's recession in Germany. 500,000 job losses in Italy and Germany as a result of this. So I think that will get a very popular hearing against this increased military spending. So people can do practical things. They can take things back to their trade union branches and start passing motions calling for exactly that, calling for an end to the militarization and an end to arms sales, an end to sanctions. But also there's other practical things I think I didn't get time to mention, but I wanted to talk about the Kononovich brothers, two Ukrainian communists who are currently on show trial in Ukraine, and they have appealed for Western MEPs, Western politicians and journalists to report on to attend their trial and to report on it so that they can see the true nature of the Zelensky regime. So this is another thing that people can do in their trade union branches, is raise the issue of freedom for the Kononovich brothers. Their case has been raised in the European Parliament. And finally, we can also call for the lifting of the ban on RT, on Sputnik, and on all Russian media organizations, which are being scapegoated by the government, by Ofgem, who are saying that they're not reporting impartially. And Reporters Without Borders, of course, has launched a campaign just last week calling for the blocking of Eutelsat from broadcasting Russian channels. So we can campaign for an end to that, so people can actually receive a balanced news on what's happening. They can see the truth from what's happening on the ground. So those are all little things that we can do to shift away from that.
Thanks, Steve. I have John Parker, John Ross, Camilla, and Demetrios. So John Parker, please go ahead.
Yeah, on the question of what can we do, also, like Steve was saying, this is paralleling with the economic devastation of working people in the countries. In the United States, we've got inflation that's the highest it's been for 40 years. People are unable to feed their children. They're unable to pay for rent. So the housing crisis is increasing. People are dying of COVID. In the United States, about 1,100,000 people died of COVID needlessly because they wanted to the worry about profits over people's lives. And Biden is sending billions and billions of dollars, to Ukraine for weapons. $16 billion was directly supposed to go to COVID funds. And he said he wiped that. He said, forget that. We're sending it to Ukraine. We're going to get the javelins to Ukraine and all these other things. The same weapons that you see on the dark web that are showing up, that are being disseminated all over the world, thanks to the U.S. So all of these crises, I believe the war really isn't popular in those things. People want to feed themselves. People want to do something about climate change, which is devastating everyone in this whole world. And they don't want to see Nancy Pelosi go to China and create some more problems, or this proxy war. They want an end to that. So that's one of the things to highlight those contradictions. And the other thing about the why is it that people are now have a different attitude from the person who was saying that. I was looking at his T-shirt and I'm saying changes. He has David Bowie on his T-shirt. That's a song. And the reason is the change is that the social media, like I was saying before, has been taken over by these NATO and US intelligence forces. So Facebook, the Atlantic Council, I think they're on Twitter, one of the either Twitter or Reddit. They now decide, Facebook has a line, I think it's the Australian one or the Atlantic Council. It's one of these NATO or US intelligence services that decides what gets censored and what gets added to Facebook. They pressured Facebook because they said, you were allowing ISIS and others to grow on your platform, so we're going to take over now. And Zuckerberg decided that was okay to do that. And so so when you see things on Facebook, it's been censored by US intelligence groupings. So all these things are the reasons why on social media, why things, which makes our job a lot harder, but that's why we have to get out in the streets. We have to be very vocal. We have to be very public. We have to build coalitions, and the left has to unite and listen to what we're saying here today and unite to stop US imperialism's attacks on the world. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, John. John Ross, please go ahead.
Yeah, first on the question of why there's so much confusion, because a part of the left in the global north has decided to capitulate to imperialism on the question. That's a very simple answer to that. And you can tell this by, in addition to the issues, by looking at the hopelessness of the arguments that are put forward, right? Firstly, you have people who proclaim the enemy is at home. We have to concentrate our own enemy, who then go out on the streets with demonstrations, the main slogan of which is Russian troops out. Well, maybe somebody in Russia might find that the enemy is at home, but if you're in Britain and you're saying the enemy, we've got to combat the enemy at home, and your first slogan is Russian troops out, then your position is fake, right? Secondly, we have the argument about, is Russia imperialist? Well, I don't actually think that Russia is imperialist, but it's actually irrelevant, because under certain conditions, you can form alliances with imperialists. I mean, nobody was more imperialist than Winston Churchill, a racist, anti-Semitic, anti-working class person. Was the Soviet Union wrong to form an alliance with Winston Churchill to fight against Nazi Germany? No. Even if Russia was imperialist, it doesn't mean that you can't take a position in the war. So this is a completely fake argument. On the question that Russia had other means, maybe they have other means, maybe they don't. It's not the position of Marxism that you take a position on the war that somebody has chosen the wrong way to resolve a problem. I'm afraid on the sides which we supported, don't have illusions that people haven't taken wrong positions, or that horrific things are not done by the sides we support in war. War is so terrible that there are horrific actions which are carried out by people. I tend to believe that most of the accounts of the atrocities in Ukraine are probably true, said by both sides. That is not the position you take on a war because of the fact that there are other means which are available. You've got to take it on the fundamental forces. What is so disgraceful about this is actually it is the left, and I'll put it bluntly, the white left in the global north, which is isolated. Look at the positions which are taken by this. I did a very interesting thing. If you look at the countries which are implementing sanctions against Russia, these countries represent 15% of the world's population. 85% of the world's population doesn't support it. Of this 15%, only 200 million are in countries that are not white dominated. That's why I say quite rightly that it's a white dominated left which has got the position. On other positions, in addition to sanctions, the attempt to block the use of airspace. Only 12% of the world's population of the world's countries has agreed to block Russian planes. It's not people isolated. It is the United States and its allies which are actually isolated from the point of view of this situation, but because it's unpopular, sections of the left have come up with fake arguments to give in to what their imperialists are doing, instead of going back to the fundamental thing that war is the continuation of politics by the means. If it is the case that NATO is at the root of this war, which it is, then that's the first thing which needs to be said in the situation, not about the Russian troops. And finally, on the question of self-determination, I think in many ways it would have been preferable if the Ukraine had continued as a multinational state. I think up until 2014, it was possible for both sections of the population, but the pogroms and the attacks which are launched by the Kiev regime, in my opinion, now have led to the fact you can't put the thing back together again. And therefore, that means, as the Kiev regime is going to do it, the left is going to have to stand up for the right of the people of East Ukraine, of the Crimea, of parts of the South Ukraine, to have the right of self-determination and not to give in to the military attack which will be carried out by the Kiev regime against them. And that's what the real issue, which is the left has got to face up, because this war is going to go on, I'm afraid, for quite a long time, because NATO is interested in fighting to the last Ukrainian, as it was quite rightly put, and because it is instigating the Kiev regime to carry out policies which could only be carried out by military and nationalist fascist terror in South and East Ukraine. So I'm afraid this war's not going to be over, and those people who've taken the wrong position right at the beginning are going to find themselves in worse and worse position on this. And that's why the left has got to be absolutely clear on the fundamental politics of this right from the beginning. Right, end.
Thank you very much, John. I still have Demetrios and Jenny as responding. And Camilla, I see you've gone away. If you still want to respond in this round of questions, please come back in and raise your hand. So Demetrios, please go ahead.
Yes, continuing on John Ross' remark, I would say also that in a way, this is a situation wanted by the West, because the West had to solve a problem, and the problem was that the Soviet Union was formally dissolved in December 91, but was not really dissolved. The war in Ukraine, which began by the Kiev regime in 2014, it had as an object to create a situation where the former Soviet republics could not unite or cooperate. And this is also a defeat for Russia, especially its project of Eurasian integration has failed because it took into account only economic factors and not social factors. If there is still something which is really uniting all Soviet nations, it is the anti-oligarchic mood which exists everywhere, but for obvious reasons, Russia could not exploit this. And Americans had to rush, because if they did not do it, they would see the re-emergence, because the Ukrainian so to say, integration in the West led to the disaster. Ukraine lost 10 million people of its population. It was a real economic and social disaster. Objectively, that would lead to tendencies to a kind of reintegration of the Soviet space. And I think this is why the Americans precipitated the coup d'etat in Kiev in 2014. But okay, this is about history. Now, I think to oppose the war, we must try to link its consequence, the consequences of the Western policy, to their roots. I mean, it's because of the sanctions. First of all, they give arms to Ukraine, which cannot win a war against Russia. this way, the only thing they do is they destroy Ukrainian people and this country. They don't do anything else. The second thing is that they with this policy, they provoke serious social and economic hardships in the West itself. And we must link the result and the reason. The reason is the sanctions policy. And the result is that we're going towards a very serious social crisis in the West. Instead of saying half-truths, we must ask for lifting the sanctions now. And there is a huge place for a left which would call for this. Unfortunately, Western left is run either by people who are afraid, either by, and opportunists, either by people who are connected to the Western financial interests and to NATO. And if the situation does not change very quickly, the result will be a rise of the far right in America and Western Europe. They will not stop the war. They will go the West towards a fascist direction. I believe that we must insist also on the ecological questions. What is this ridiculous person which pretends to be the foreign minister of Germany and who comes from the Greens? They are blacks. All their policies are destroying the environment. And I believe there we can have a support for large sections of the Western public opinion, which is also sensitive to this question. And also we must go on speaking of the nuclear dangers. Okay, even if we want to support Ukraine, we're not going to blow up all the planet in order to support Ukraine. We did not do it in order to support Czechoslovakia or Poland or Hungary during the Cold War. Why we should do it now? A practical thing, it would be because there are many people who are more or less saying all this in the West, and I believe we're not so isolated. In reality, we're isolated from the official intellectuals and from the leadership of the various leftist parties and trade unions, but we're not at all isolated from the public opinion. The public opinion in the West is understanding this. Otherwise, with such propaganda, they should have 99% of support. They don't have it.
Thank
and
you,
I don't know what. So it is an important, a practical thing would be to try to network all the networks, because in this way we will get more. It is difficult, but this is in reality, in the long run, if we don't produce a strategic counter vision to Western capitalism and imperialism, we will fall victims. I don't know how to put it. Maybe Samir Amin spoke and Hugo Chavez of the Fifth International, but it is clear that it is not enough to resist and not to propose an alternative vision. Because after all, the basis for the support of those policies in the West is something which is not said, but it is meant. That by keeping the West dominant in the planet, we are going to keep your level of life and things like that. It is no more true. This cannot continue. We must invent a new world. Otherwise, this is an unsustainable world. It will fall on Western citizens also themselves.
Thank you, Demetrios. Okay, so I have Jenny and Camilla, and then we will have a final round of questions. So, Jenny, please go ahead.
So I've been asked a direct question, what alternative did Russia have? Well, I'm a China specialist, and when I look at China, I see that there are differences between how China reacts and how Russia reacts. Of course, there is a different situation because Taiwan is a part of China and Ukraine is its own independent state. I think that when Russia issued those series of points about the Ukraine neutrality, the Minsk agreements, and they also talked about, ending US bases, US withdrawing from Europe, arms control, and so on. All of these things as well. I thought that was really great, but was it practical? And when you look at what China's done, of course, China wants all of those things. It wants, the United States to stop pointing its missiles. It wants the United States to, take its aircraft carriers and fighter jets away from China and close all those military bases. But it has one single red line, and it makes absolutely clear what that red line was. Everybody now who watches the news all over the world knows what China's red line is. It doesn't clutter the whole thing up with a whole load of other demands. It doesn't allow itself to get boxed into a corner. And I think the response that it's made is appropriate and measured. I think that China, Russia, what Putin doesn't see is the bigger picture. He's not a Marxist-Leninist. He doesn't think about how to utilize the contradictions. John mentioned, using the contradictions between imperialist powers. There were contradictions within NATO that were developing. The United States is a declining power. It's making more and more mistakes. The Pelosi visit was a mistake. You watch the debates that are going on in the US in the mainstream press. There's a lot of disagreement about this now. The US, a lot of people are seeing how provocative the United States is and how in complete disregard of the interests of people it is. Sometimes it's a question of time, and you just wait for the other side to make a mistake, and then you're prepared, to react to that. So I don't know whether that is a sufficient answer. I doubt it to the person who asked that question. I think, John originally talked about Clausewitz. I would talk about Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu is the art of avoiding war. And I think that is what China is seeking to apply all the time. In terms of what we can do, I mean, I think that we have to build unity amongst the anti-war activists along with organizations like No to NATO, which has been an international campaign which has existed, in the NATO member countries for years and years, along with No to NATO, along with organizations like Code Pink and others in the United States. We had the slogan, which was Russian troops out. And No to NATO expansion. So I think to just look at the Western left and lump the whole of the Western left together as capitulating to imperialism, I don't think that is helpful in working out what can be done, because I think that we need to unite. I think those two slogans, Russian troops out, No to NATO expansion, were two sides of the same coin. It's one and the other, not one or the other. And so those organizations that I mentioned are gradually building up awareness amongst the general population about the provocation of NATO expansion. I think that people are learning that this is a much more complex situation, that there is more than one cause. I think that on the question of the UN vote, I think there's a lot of misinterpretation about that UN vote. That there was a lot of 141 countries out of 190 did deplore the Russian action and call for the troops out. Had the motion been worded differently to condemn rather than deplore, then there would have been a lot less countries voting for it. And of course, a lot of countries, the big developing countries that John mentioned voted to abstain. They abstained, which means that they didn't actually support Russia's action, but they weren't going to, deplore it either. I think that the other thing that we can do, apart from trying to unite more, is I think that, the people have talked about World War III. We're now in this contradiction between the US and China. I think that people know generally in the peace movement, and in general in the peace movement, people know so little about China that if we keep our focus on Russia, we should be talking more about China and China's positions and why China is going back to UN principles. I think that there was some comments about, the UN. China is talking about those principles. Those principles came out of an equal agreement between the major powers, and that is what we have to get back to. This is what is at stake here. So I think that the other thing that we need to do is to take very seriously. China is doing a lot of activity. For example, its initiative in the UN to get countries to sign up to the UN principles. I think that we also should be thinking, and I hope that people can take away here two things. One is the notion of indivisible and common security, which is what both sides failed to do, which led to the Ukraine war. One is the question of territorial integrity, and two is the question of not respecting the security concerns of other countries. So again, these are two sides of the same coin, and we need to build together in the anti-war movement and promote this notion of indivisible and common security. Common security also includes all of those aspects of the environment, of public health, of economic stability, and so on. And I think that these are the core ideas on which we can unite a meaningful international peace movement. And this is what lies ahead for us. And I would also, somebody says indivisible security is what the US refuses to discuss. Precisely. And that's why we need to campaign on it. And we need to get people to understand the meaning of indivisible and common security. Finally, I just appeal to people, and perhaps this will come up as another discussion, to take very seriously China's proposal for a global security initiative.
Actually, that's a very good and practical thing, which may well be the practical outcome of this very amazing set of reflections, Jenny. So thank you. Demetrios has also proposed the same. But let me go to Camilla. Camilla will answer her part of whatever she wants to respond to in this round of questions, and then I will take 4 more questions, and that will be the last. Camilla, please go ahead.
Okay, so I think the 2 questions that I'm responding to is, how do we unpopularize the war in NATO countries, and why have we gotten to this point where I believe Yuri said where communist movement where there's not so much pushback against war and intervention and sanctions in the cases of Syria and Russia, as we might have seen before when there was an anti-war intervention against the Iraq war. Well, I wanted to highlight the responsibility of figures and anyone with a platform at all, but above all, organizations in the global north. It's never too late to, update one's position. And for the sake of clarification, take responsibility, and instructing the bases. The bases is like the masses in the country, the people who hear from you as an organization, as a pillar of the anti-imperialist movement. And we have really fallen short of this in the United States specifically. Obviously, I grew up in the US, so I pay a little more attention to that, but also in the UK and other places. We need to be clear as the situation develops and moves and updates, that we update and clarify our position. That is the responsibility of these organizations to the masses in those countries. And it's really important because these anti-imperialist organizations in the global north, whether they're like a peace movement or an anti-war movement, or they consider themselves to be some sort of a leftist organizations, largely functioning as solidarity organizations, we have to be honest. These organizations in your countries where you all live, they're not providing material support for us in the global south. You're not sending us thousands of dollars. In fact, myself, any of the organizing I've done, any of the work I've done, I mean, and in the media I do, the reporting I do, we don't receive funds from you, from any of your organizations at all whatsoever. We run on nothing. Neither do the Campesino movement or any of the anti-imperialist movements or the political parties here at all. We don't receive material support, not a single dime from you in your solidarity actions. So if that's the case, and we're being honest about the fact that we don't actually see any money, any material support, what we need to be seeing is, for you to act as protagonists in your own countries and in your own communities to build the alternative, which is necessarily the implementation of socialism wherever you are. We need to see, we've already agreed that intervention is bad. Foreign intervention is bad, intervening in other countries, interference, war, and that imperialism is bad. But we have to advance in our political and ideological formation and understanding what exists beyond imperialism. And so I think what you can be doing in your own countries to try to depopularize, these wars and these imperialist ideas is become protagonists and try to, invoke, promote the ideas and the existing socialism that exists here, that we have seen in countries like Bolivia, where you are in your own countries. So highlight, for example, the successful anti-imperialist models in the global south, things like, for example, the need for fuel subsidies in your countries, the way we see in Nicaragua, in Bolivia. For example, why can't that be implemented there? You need to be agitating over that. You need to be agitating over why your countries, wherever you are, the UK, the US, Canada, can't supply your own fertilizer, the way in which the movement towards socialism here has been producing its own fertilizer, why the wealthiest nations in history aren't food sovereign when the poorest countries in the entire world, at least in our hemisphere, the United States has the poorest countries, and including, according to some indices, are Nicaragua and Nicaragua and Bolivia. Nicaragua and Bolivia are the most food sovereign countries in our hemisphere, and they're the poorest. What does that tell you about how things are working out in the global north? That they have to steal and ravage from other countries, and they're complaining about Russia withholding fertilizer and withholding food and agriculture supply for the entire world when our countries are so fucking poor and we are devastated and deliberately, intentionally underdeveloped because of imperialism, but supplying our own food to our peoples. That's what needs to be implemented there. You need to be protagonists in your own country. And if you started doing the socialism, started implementing socialism where you are, you would have a better understanding of how things work throughout the globe. I think that is one way. You can't just be on Zoom or talking about uniting or this and that in the abstract. You need to be doing it.
Very powerful, Camilla. Thank you very much. Okay, we have now 4 last questions, and unless there are any more, this will be the last round. I think there probably will be last round anyway. So I will take Jean-Claude Delony, then Adam Jassal, then Philip Sachirovich, I hope I said that right, and Robert Richard. So Jean-Claude, please go ahead.
I would like to come back to the goal, I think, of this symposium, of this conference, which is to think about how to motivate the left people in our different countries to have a better understanding of this situation. And my question are concerned with this basic goal of your conference. I have three questions, and I am not going to develop. The first one is, it's a question to the conference people. For me, I think, and I ask if you are okay, the situation is done or is motivated by the fact that imperialism is weakening. And I don't say United States, I say imperialism, because French is weakening, because Germany is weakening, because Japan is weakening, etc. Imperialism is weakening. And the paradox of this situation is that they are more dangerous when they are weakening. What do you think of this? Second question is that why they are more dangerous and weakening? To my opinion, and I ask you the question, it is that not only because of socialism, it is also because, and I think some of you have said, because of underdeveloped or developing countries. Russia is not capitalist, is not socialist, but there is 20% of people in this country which is voting communist, and they are not agree with the capitalist system, and they want to develop. And after all, well, so development, to my opinion, is also one reason of weakening of this system. What do you think of this? And my last question, but it is concerned with this, is the goal of, we should explain to the left people, now the goal is not to be against capitalism, it is to be against imperialism as a system in which United States are the main point, but not the only one. We have to be against and to be for a new social order. Somebody was talking of this, I agree, but I ask you your opinion. Just thank you.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Adam Jussel. Adam, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I just had a question to ask. So it's more about the China-Taiwan conflict, but I'll say it word for word. So basically, I speak Japanese, and as funny as this may sound, what should I say to my Japanese friends who also have an interest in politics to make them favor multipolarity?
Mm-hmm.
Or like what are some convincing points I could bring up that would help them or make them think that it's not in their country's best interest to be a friend of the US as they are now? If that's worded properly, I'd be delighted if you could answer that. So.
Great, thank you, Adam. Next is Philip. Please go ahead.
Thank you, everyone. I'm Philip, and I'm assuming some might imagine that I'm from Russia. I'm not. I'm actually from Serbia. So I was 12 years old when Yugoslavia was bombed. I kind of have certain first-hand experience in the receiving end of imperialism. I went through it unscathed, thankfully. One of my classmates lost her father in the first night of the bombing and stuff like that, and it wasn't pretty, let's say that, and keep it short. So of course we could all agree that NATO has provoked this conflict and all of that. But in imperialist conflicts, there's always one side that provokes, the other that blinks, and then war breaks out. However, I have to say that I'm a little surprised to hear all this talk about multipolarity as being some kind of a new thing. Multipolarity has existed since 1815 in the Congress of Vienna, when the Concert of Europe was created, and when imperialist powers always made a pinky promise that they are going to peacefully divide the colonies. And then, of course, when capitalists entered its bust cycle, all those promises went down the water. And the same thing is happening now. Of course, some imperialist bloc is going to be weaker and rising, other one is going to be dominant and failing. That's how the previous two world wars started. So what I would like to ask is, why at this point is there so little talk about class struggle, about the working class as a unified social force? Why why do we always talk about the need to dismantle imperialism, the need to dismantle NATO? Yeah, sure, it would be great to dismantle NATO imperialism. What then? Without a socialist revolution, the libertarian, right-wing libertarian dream about dismantling multinational corporations and going back to mom and pop shops. It's not economically realistic and it's not politically realistic. You can only move forward. And in order to do that, you can't just abstract imperialism from capitalism. And a multipolar world would basically reflect what's going on in Serbia now. Serbia is a co-dominion. Serbia is a neo-colony of everyone. That's why it's purportedly neutral, because we have German corporations, Italian corporations, we have Chinese corporations. We have Chinese corporations using Vietnamese labor whose passports they have sold and won't release them. And they've only, that only broke into the public eye because of local working class activists. We have an Australian company wanting to mine our lithium. We also have huge lithium reserve. And we have imperialism actually co-governing Serbia, all of the belligerent sides. We have Russia, who stole our oil industry for peanuts in the early 2000s as well, and is now basically dictating our energy policy. So we have
if you would please get to a question, Philip, that would be great.
My question is there anything we could, this secular workers in countries which are shared in wartime by the belligerent imperialist powers? And also, why is there no question about of the working class in Russia and the working class in China? Should we? Is there a silent expectation that they should wait until there's further revolution in the West, or maybe, just maybe, those gigantic and powerful and concentrated industrial proletarian masses should first fight against their own war, against their own regime, which would exclude the struggle for multipolarity, and in fact reaffirm Lenin's line that every Marxist should fight against their own imperialism first. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And final question from Robert. Please go ahead.
Good morning from what's called the state of Eastern Washington here in the Spokane tribe. I'm privileged to live in. John Parker was good. I liked him. I wanted to know, doesn't he think the Galicians considered themselves Aryans, which the Nazis emulated? And isn't that closer to the truth that Adolf Schicklgruber, aka Hitler, more of a Bandera type puppet like Zelensky is for the US as a comprador?
Okay, thank you. Very exemplary brief question. Okay, so I would now like to request those among the speakers who would like to respond to this round of questions to please raise their hand. I have Jenny first, but I'm sure others will come up as well. Thank you. Go ahead, Jenny.
Okay, so the two of the questions, what you should say to your Japanese friends about multipolarity. I mean, you know, we're in this situation which John Ross described at the beginning of US domination. In other words, the US is not treating other powers and other states as equals. And this is profoundly destabilizing, as we've been talking about throughout this time. I think that from the point of view of Japan, surely it's focused on its region and the East Asian region is expanding, has a huge potential, continuing potential for economic development. And I think that so long as the relations between the countries are handled properly and coordinated, that the region can benefit. So from Japan's point of view, the last thing that they should want to see in their region is the kind of destabilization that has happened in Europe. So I hope that that's something that is useful to you. And the second point about multipolarity, that this idea that multipolarity has existed since the beginning of the 19th century. I mean, I think that, that multipolarity, we have to understand, is crisscrossed by contradictions. So there are contradictions between imperialists and anti-imperialist powers. There are contradictions between capitalism and socialism. There are contradictions between hegemony and counter-hegemony. And I think that this is the balance of powers and the shift we can see, has gone through various qualitative changes. So in the first place, the character and the character of multipolarity, if you like, changed profoundly with the Russian Revolution and the existence of a Soviet state. So that considerably opened up the possibilities. And secondly, the multipolar situation changed profoundly in the worldwide anti-fascist struggle. And I'm saying this, I think, for the third time, that the major powers were forced to recognize each other as equals in order to defeat fascism. And the United Nations was set up on the basis of that. And I wouldn't say, as I said when I gave my talk, multipolarity is about the shifting balance of power, but it's not just about power relations. It's about the quality of interactions between the states involved. And I think that we are now at a stage of, as some people have talked about, the new international world order, where we have qualitatively different relationships between states in order to maintain peaceful relations, in order to resolve disputes through dialogue, and in order to have win-win arrangements, which is going to spread the benefits more widely. I think the other part about what the Chinese working class and the Russian working class should do, I think we've in IMG, we've had quite a lot of discussions about those. I think that we have to think in terms of stages, taking things a step at a time. Clearly, the Chinese workers, although there's obviously exploitation, but on the whole, they're seeing their situation improving bit by bit by bit. And so long as it does so, they've got some hope for the future.
Thanks very much, Jenny. Okay, perhaps fittingly, I have the last and the first speaker of our panel still waiting to speak. So probably we will end with them. So Demetrios and John. But before I go to Demetrios, may I please also say that in addition to Alan's appeals about donating, etc., please also consider signing the manifesto of the International Manifesto Group. You can find it at www.internationalmanifesto.org, and it's been translated by humans, not machines, into a number of languages. So you can also circulate them widely. Okay, Demetrios, please go ahead.
I have a huge respect for the contribution of the British No to War movement along the years. But I'm afraid that if it wants to have a positive contribution, it should revise its slogan about the retreat of Russian troops from Ukraine. Why I say so? First, who will guarantee? By the way, when we say from Ukraine, we mean also from Crimea, I suppose. Huh? So I ask you, who will guarantee the rights of the Russian majority, which is populating Donbass and Crimea, its security. It is obvious that if we let the Ukrainian armed forces and their neo-Nazis, militias incorporated into them, go there, there will be a pogrom. This you don't need to be a friend of Russia to understand. The second thing, why Donbass and Crimea must belong to Ukraine? From what is derived that? From the coup d'etat of Boris Yeltsin in 1991, made under the Mr. Bush at that time instructions. There was a referendum in the Soviet Union against the dissolution of the Union in 1991, March 1991. Why we adopt so easily all the narrative of Western imperialism? By the way, I'm astonished. Okay, the Russian army invaded Ukraine. Monsanto invaded also Ukraine, and nobody is speaking about. They are trying to use Ukraine to produce banned foods, which then they have to, they will export to Europe. To say the truth, because we met this type of arguments when we were trying to collect signatures to our appeal. And some of them told us that there is a nation state in Ukraine which Russia is destroying. Okay, we should come to our senses. I don't think there is something like that. And anyway, this nation state, if we consider it like that, because it is a nation state governed by very corrupted oligarchs at the service of Western powers. So even if we think the existence of such a state is a good thing, excuse me, we cannot begin by telling that they have to occupy again Donbass and Crimea. And by the way, this is a totally unrealistic position. You know that this will never happen. That means we give a kind of moral argument to the West for free, and in the same time, we are risking to have the war perpetuated forever and lead to its terrible results, because only a global disaster can come out of it. Even if we want to support Ukrainians to the end, it's impossible. It is not reasonable to blow up the planet for this reason. So I believe that we have to ask for a verified ceasefire and beginning of negotiations, and in the same time, lifting of sanctions and lifting of the armament of Ukraine, for a freezing of the conflict, that is. And to tell you, I was very happy that I saw the Corbyn some days ago at last speak for the necessity of stopping the armament of Ukraine. It is, even if we accept that Russia is locally the aggressor, there is no doubt that the Western imperialism is the aggressor on the global scale. And this is the big image, the determining factor, I believe. Without
Okay, I think Demetrios is gone for longer than his usual very short break. So for the moment, I will go to John Ross, and perhaps Demetrios will come back later. I'm going to mute him for now. So John, please go ahead.
Yes, I've just got to say, for people who talk about class struggle, we're only just at the beginning of class struggle in this. The way I would characterize the situation in Ukraine is the US is discussing whether it can pass from Cold War to hot war. I helped set up an organization called No Cold War, which exactly campaigns against the Cold War. And that is what the US has decided upon. But there is a very great risk in this situation that the United States will decide that Cold War is not enough and hot war is required. This flows from the simple fact that it's as I said at the beginning, it's losing to China. If there is peaceful economic competition, the United States will lose for the fundamental reason that socialism is a more fundamentally productive economic system than capitalism is. And the United States is relatively aware of this. Therefore, but the United States knows it has a window of opportunity discussion opportunity in their sense, maybe 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, in which it still enjoys military supremacy. And the very great risk is therefore it will decide to deploy this military supremacy. That this incidentally is what's behind Pelosi's trip to United States. There is a division within the ruling class. Some people within the US ruling class think it's an adventure to try to have a hot war with China or with Russia, and that it won't work out well for the United States. Some on the contrary want it, but there is a very great risk in this period, and therefore we're entering into a prolonged period of struggle. And therefore the left has got to get it right in this situation. If the United States were able to crush China and detach Russia, we are entering into decades, at the best, more possibly centuries, of domination by the US imperialism. But let's keep it, let's call it a century or something like that. In the next 10 to 15 years, the question of whether China and Russia can defeat this US imperialist aggression is the biggest class struggle in the world. And it is that on which the war, people who want to oppose the war have got to concentrate. It is not, if you consider an imperialist country, the aim is to oppose your own imperialism. In that case, the first thing you do is not go out on the streets with signs which say Russian troops out of Ukraine, which is what people have been doing. That's not to oppose one's own imperialism. And therefore, I see this as the beginning of a tremendous shift in the left. What I'm very gratified to see is in the global South, bluntly, there is not very much confusion. It is even if you take the vote in the United Nations on the most asinine of all resolutions against the invasion without doing anything about it, only 4 countries representing only 42% of the world's population voted for that. The majority of the world's population was 9 countries which voted even for this resolution which called to do nothing. And as regards the one which actually means something, which is to do sanctions, I said 85% of the population of the world lives in countries which refuse to go along it. It is rather shameful that sections of the left in the global north, in a situation in which the global south, not merely socialists, not even leftists, but just, regimes that are just oppressed by imperialism, even when they don't fight very much against it, that sections of the left in the global north, because they feel under pressure, have gone along with what the imperialist ruling classes are campaigning for. They may feel isolated in the global north. They should stand up for it. What do they confront? They don't have to confront the situation of imperialism. They're not being bombed. They're not being imprisoned, etc. Or most of them are not being imprisoned. They just need a little bit of moral courage. And it's a bit disgraceful that in this situation where the great majority of the world's population has not gone along with what the United States is doing, that some people have been given into this. Not everybody, not the whole left. On the contrary, it's very important, there's a recomposition in the left, that the people who stood up to this imperialist offensive are the core of what is the position on the left. So it's not the whole of the left, but it is rather shameful what sections of the left have been doing on this. And as usual, unfortunately, it'll be the Chinese working class and the Russian working class and the working class of the global south that is having to fight for interests in this. And the least that the left can do in the global north is stand on their side and not run away. Right, end.
Thank you, John. And finally, John Parker, I guess last word to you.
Okay, thanks. Just to answer some of these questions real quick, the one about the weakening of the necessity, let's see, what was it? Class of the premise. Okay, about how the imperialism gets weakened. Well, the imperialism is weakening, like some of the folks had said before, because of the ruling class's need to maximize profits, make every decision based on finding the highest return on investments, which is causing the inflation crisis. The investments in public necessities like baby formula or deteriorating infrastructure or mass transit is sacrificed to invest in the gambling on Wall Street for cryptocurrency or whatever brings the highest returns, just like funding of the war. That's one reason. On Stepan Bandera, who's now lauded in Ukraine today, and in fact, it's Victory Day in Ukraine and the defeat of the Nazis. It's illegal to celebrate that in Zelensky's Ukraine. You can only celebrate in the Donbass region. And you know, Bandera was responsible for the genocide against Jewish and Polish peoples in the Ukraine, killing tens of thousands of people in cooperation with the Nazi Germany. So that's who's being lauded in Zelensky's Ukraine right now. And also on the issue of, again, Russia, which others have talked about, you know, since 2014 and the first violations of the Minsk agreements, the Ukrainian tanks began bombing the people of Krimskoye, and other parts. But these are the parts that I visited in Krimskoye and Kiniki, I'm probably saying it wrong, where there were no military targets and people were about to be slaughtered if not for the Lugansk People's Militia and the advisors that they had from Russia. But that was not enough. And the horror and the torture and the rape and the things that I could see that these people were dealing with, when you look in their eyes and you go to the shelters over there and you look at these people's eyes, and if you to have the audacity to say, you need to get your protectors, the Russian military, out. And they would be horrified at that because their children are being protected by those Russian troops. Can't ignore that. Can't ignore that. It's completely arrogant to ignore that. And just so folks know that there are, you know, besides my organization, there's other organizations in the United States that have another view, the correct view on the Ukraine. There's another organization called the Black Alliance for Peace, is another large anti-war organization, which I'm also a member of. So there's hope. And on the question I saw in the chat on white supremacists supported by Russia thing that's going on. Well, you know, there is confusion. There was confusion about Trump and other things. And that was a reaction to the heightened imperialism by Biden and Obama, creating confusion about who their allies are, and without understanding the reality of what the Republican Party actually represents. However, that confusion should not equate any misunderstanding about white supremacy with the actual billions of dollars by the US government to support white supremacy, not only with billions of dollars, but military training of those Nazis in the Ukraine. And also that spills over to us here in the United States. For example, Alina Semeniaka, who was a representative of the Azov Battalion, acknowledged that she had met with groups of a group here in California called the American Rise Above Movement. And these are the ones who organized the riots in Charlottesville, the Nazi riot in Charlottesville that killed Heather Heyer by a white supremacist who drove into the counter protest. Those three were arrested in Virginia later on, but it's just an example of how, you know, this billions of dollars supporting these Nazi regimes comes over here, so you can't equate that with some confusion about Trump that some Russians might have. And you know, finally, today we have the opportunity to take these heightened contradictions that expose imperialism in the United States and Western Europe, which makes the working class that we all deal with and work with understand understand greater today who their allies are, who their enemies are, and how, whether it's talking about COVID or your rent to pay for your housing or your food, they understand that much more today. It's clear that it's US imperialism, Western imperialism, their own ruling classes that are the ones that are in the way of their own human progress. So let's take advantage of that. Let's unite. And like others are saying, let's concentrate on fighting the real enemy, not the person, not the grouping, not Russia, which is actually helping to protect many of the developing countries that are targets of US imperialism, but the real enemy of US and Western imperialism. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, John. I would like to now bring this event to a close by, first of all, thanking all the speakers who put in so much work into this excellent presence, the absolutely excellent and inspiring presentations. I would like to say that I'm not saying using the word inspiring lightly. I think that this discussion has actually given rise to a lot of ideas for new initiatives, including, I think, responding to Camilla's excellent point that, you know, it's perhaps important to stop talking and start acting. And I think that we may be trying to, you know, by the way, if you sign the manifesto, you automatically become a member of the organization and you come to meetings. So, and we will be having a meeting in late August. So think about that. But we will be planning perhaps to have some kind of international initiative along the lines suggested by Demetrios, by Camilla, and by the other speakers. So thank you very much for all these ideas. Another idea we had also is to perhaps have a panel of the journalists and other people who have actually been to Ukraine in the context of the current conflict and can report from there what they have really seen and so on, because I think we have a lot of people like that, is including Steve and I think John, who has also been, and others. And I think that would also be quite a useful thing to do. So we've had a number of interesting questions. And I think one of the other things that has come out of all this is that it is imperative for the left to be very clear about the meaning of imperialism today. The old style, pox on all your houses, everybody is imperialist, is not working. We have to identify and differentiate between the oldest, most powerful, and at the present moment, most desperate and violent forms of imperialism from anything else. I mean, I'm not suggesting that no other country is imperialist, but I think there is something historically unique about Western and US imperialism, as I think Jean-Claude Delaunay was also underlining. So we have to try to understand that and orient our politics around that. So anyway, I just want to say thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to all the audience where you have all remained here in significant strength, nearly 130, with a couple of dozen also listening on YouTube. So thanks very much. And I know that our webinars, which are unfortunately held rather early for North Americans and Americans generally, will be listened to later on as well. So I think you've made a big contribution. Please watch out for our next seminar, which is about the Americas. It's a bit later in the day, and it's about the United States role in the Americas in the context of the Summit of the Americas and so on. You will get advertisements for that very soon. So once again, having said all that, thank you very much, and see you at our next webinar. Bye-bye.
Thank you.